The sky over the Montana Territory on the morning of January 9, 1887, did not look like air. It looked like a bruised muscle, swollen with a violence that the local cattlemen were too arrogant to respect. The temperature had hovered deceptively around 40 degrees at dawn, a cruel invitation that led men to leave their heavy coats on the peg. But by noon, the mercury was plummeting with the speed of a falling stone. High above the rolling plains, the wind began to scream, a sound not unlike a banshee mourning the dead before they had even died, signaling the arrival of a pressure system so immense it would later be recorded as one of the most catastrophic meteorological events in American history. In the center of this looming white hell, on a patch of scrubland that the wealthy ranchers deemed unfit for grazing, stood a structure that defied every convention of Western architecture. It looked less like a home and more like a massive, festering wound on the landscape. A chaotic, rounded mound of refuse, discarded wheat stalks, and mud that rose barely 6 feet off the frozen ground. To the passing eye, it was an eyesore, a testament to poverty and madness. But inside the mind of Mei Lin, a widow of 60 who had buried a husband in the gold fields and a father in the railroad cuts, there was no madness, only the cold, hard calculation of survival. She stood outside the entrance, a low tunnel facing away from the north, and watched the horizon disappear behind a curtain of white fury. While her neighbors in town were currently securing their sash windows and stoking their cast-iron stoves, confident in the thin protection of milled lumber, Mei Lin knew something they did not. She knew that when the temperature dropped to 40 below zero, wood would freeze and crack like glass, and nails would transmit the frost straight into the heart of a house. She patted the rough, hairy flank of her creation, a monstrosity of compressed hay and earth. If you are watching this from the comfort of a heated room, take a moment to subscribe, because the physics of what this woman built might just change how you see the walls around you. The storm was coming, and the hay igloo, as the town had laughingly christened it, was the only thing standing between her and a frozen death. To understand why Mei Lin was piling refuse into a dome while others were buying coal, we have to rewind 3 months to the late autumn harvest, when the air was still crisp and filled with the scent of dried sage. The Montana Territory was booming, flush with the money of cattle barons who believed the grass would never stop growing and the winter would always be mild. But Mei Lin remembered the stories of her grandfather in the Heilongjiang province of northern China, a place where the winds from Siberia could strip the flesh from a man's face in minutes. She remembered the shelter structures of the poor, built not to fight the wind, but to hide from it. When her husband died, leaving her with nothing but a small, undesirable plot of rocky soil and a meager pension, she realized she could not afford the $400 required to build a standard timber frame shanty, nor the $80 a season for coal. She had looked at the waste left behind by the threshers, the massive piles of discarded wheat straw that the ranchers burned or left to rot, and saw a resource that was worth more than gold. She enlisted the help of her nephew, Chan, a strapping young man of 25 who worked odd jobs at the livery stable. Chan was a good boy, loyal to his aunt, but even he struggled to hide his embarrassment as they began to drag cartloads of trash onto her land. "Auntie," he had said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he pitched a forkful of yellow stalks, "the men at the stable say the first heavy snow will collapse this. They say we are building a nest for rats." Not people. Mei Lin had ignored him, her hands moving with a rhythmic, practiced efficiency as she began to weave the loose straw into dense, heavy bundles. She wasn't just piling grass. She was engineering a thermal battery. She knew that dead air was the best insulator in the world, and straw was nothing but thousands of tiny, hollow tubes of dead air. The skepticism of the community was not whispered. It was shouted from the saddles of high horses. The primary antagonist in this theater of the absurd was Josiah Miller, a cattle baron whose land bordered Mei Lin's small plot. Miller was a man of the modern age, a believer in the industrial might of the expanding West, and he had just completed the construction of a 2-story Victorian farmhouse that cost nearly $3,000, a fortune in 1886. The house was a marvel of the era, featuring balloon frame construction, large glass windows imported from St. Louis, and a coal-fired furnace in the cellar. One afternoon in late November, as Mei Lin and Chan were plastering the exterior of their hay dome with a mixture of clay and water, Miller rode by on his thoroughbred, flanked by his foreman. He reined in his horse, looking down at the muddy, rounded structure with a sneer that curled his mustache. "I've seen bad luck in my time, widow," Miller shouted, his voice booming over the prairie wind. "But I've never seen a woman dig her own grave before the dying starts." He gestured to the sleek, white-painted siding of his own home in the distance. "That is civilization. This is a compost heap. When the wolf comes to the door, he won't even have to huff and puff. He'll just walk through the wall." The foreman laughed, a dry, sycophantic sound. Mei Lin did not look up from her work. She slapped a handful of mud over a seam in the straw bales. "The wolf does not eat hay, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. "But the cold eats everything." Miller shook his head, spurring his horse forward. "Don't come knocking on my door when that pile of garbage freezes you solid. I don't run a charity for fools." He rode off, confident in his timber and his coal, unaware that he was betting his life on an R-value of less than 10, while Mei Lin was constructing a fortress with an insulation factor nearly 5 times that. The construction of the shelter was a masterclass in intuitive engineering, utilizing principles that modern architects would later charge thousands to replicate. Mei Lin did not build a square. She knew that nature hates corners. Wind catches on flat surfaces, creating pressure differentials that can rip a roof off or drive cold air through the tiniest crack. Instead, she laid the foundation in a perfect circle 12 feet in diameter. She and Chun stacked the compressed bundles of straw in a spiral pattern, narrowing the diameter as the walls rose to create a self-supporting dome. This was not a loose pile. The walls were 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet at the apex. But the true genius lay in the mortar. Mei Lin used a slurry of local clay and water, which she packed into the gaps between the bales. As this mud dried, it didn't just seal the wind out, it created a thermal mess. During the day, the sun would hit the dark, earthen exterior, absorbing heat. The straw, with its millions of trapped air pockets, would prevent that heat from escaping back out, while also preventing the bitter cold from penetrating to the interior. It was the same principle used in modern passive house design, utilizing a high thermal lag. While a wooden board offers almost zero resistance to heat transfer once it is cold, the 3-foot wall of straw and earth created a barrier so dense that the temperature change on the outside would take days to register on the inside. By the time they finished in December, the structure looked prehistoric, a brown lump on the white plains. They installed a small, heavy wooden door at the end of a 6-foot low tunnel, which served as an airlock to prevent heat loss when entering or exiting. Inside, the space was surprisingly large, smelling of earth and dried grass. In the center, Mei Lin placed a small, efficient wood stove she had salvaged, running the stovepipe up through the center of the dome, packed tight with clay to prevent fire. Then came the day the world ended. It started with a stillness that felt heavy, as if the sky were holding its breath. The blue norther, as the Cowboys called it, hit on January 9th. The temperature at the local weather station dropped from a manageable 20 degrees to 32 degrees below zero in a span of 12 hours. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the wind. Gusts were clocked at 60 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally with the force of sandblasting grit. Visibility dropped to zero. A man could get lost walking from his house to his barn and freeze to death within yards of safety. Inside his grand Victorian home, Josiah Miller was beginning to realize the flaw in his investment. The large glass windows, the pride of his construction, were hemorrhaging heat. The wind hammered against the flat, broad sides of the house, causing the timber frame to groan and shudder. Despite the furnace roaring in the cellar, the drafty balloon frame construction, which lacked any insulation in the wall cavities, was allowing the heat to escape as fast as it was generated. Frost began to form inside the house, creeping up the wallpaper. Meanwhile, a mile away, in the heart of the howling void, Mei Lin sat on a buffalo robe near her small stove. The wind outside sounded like a freight train, a deafening roar that vibrated the ground, but the dome did not shake. The aerodynamic shape forced the wind to slip around it, pressing the structure firmer into the earth rather than tearing it apart. The 3-foot walls muffled the scream of the storm to a dull, distant thrum. She checked the small thermometer Chun had hung near the door. Outside, it was deathly cold, a temperature that would freeze exposed flesh in 30 seconds. Inside the compost heap, it was 65 degrees. She placed a kettle on the stove, the water beginning to boil, and waited. As the night deepened, the blizzard transformed from a weather event into a siege, a relentless, icy assault that sought to find every weakness in the structures men had built. Inside Josiah Miller's $3,000 Victorian mansion, the situation was deteriorating with terrifying speed. By 2 in the morning, the coal chute in the cellar was empty, the voracious furnace having consumed a week's worth of fuel in 12 hours trying to combat the heat loss. The balloon frame construction, a marvel of speed and efficiency in mild climates, was now acting as a sieve. Without insulation in the wall cavities, the thermal bridging was catastrophic. The cold did not just enter. It radiated from the walls themselves. Miller, wrapped in 3 fur coats and shivering violently, watched with a grim fascination as the water in the porcelain washbasin in his bedroom froze solid, the ice cracking the expensive ceramic with a sharp ping that echoed in the silent, freezing house. He had ordered his servants to break up the dining room chairs for firewood, but the dry varnish would burn too fast, offering only fleeting moments of warmth before the crushing weight of the sub-zero air returned. The temperature inside the grand house had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The nails holding the clapboards together were conducting the cold so efficiently that lines of white frost appeared on the interior plaster, ghost-like ribs marking the skeleton of the house. Miller's arrogance had frozen along with his water pipes. All that remained was the primal, gnawing fear of a man realizing his money could not bribe the laws of thermodynamics. A mile away, in the heart of the compost heap, the atmosphere was almost surreal in its tranquility. Mei Lin sat on a low stool, mending a tear in Chen's work trousers, the needle flashing in the warm glow of the oil lamp. The wind outside was a deafening roar, a physical weight pressing against the dome, but the structure did not creak. The physics of the arch were at work. The harder the wind blew, the more it compressed the straw bales together, locking them tighter into their circular geometry. Inside, the temperature was holding steady at 62 degrees. They were not burning furniture. They were burning cow chips and twisted knots of sagebrush, fuel that would have been useless in Miller's drafty fireplace but was perfectly adequate for the small, airtight space of the igloo. The 3-foot walls of straw offered an insulation value of approximately R50, nearly 10 times that of Miller's uninsulated timber walls. The clay plaster, warmed by the stove during the day, was now releasing that stored heat back into the room, a phenomenon known as thermal flywheel effect. Chan, who had been terrified hours earlier, was now asleep on his pallet, his breathing deep and rhythmic. He had taken off his heavy coat. Mei Lin poured herself a cup of hot tea, the steam rising in a lazy spiral. She did not smile, for she knew the suffering happening across the plains, but she felt a profound validation. The primitive wisdom of the steppes, the knowledge born of poverty and necessity, was outperforming the industrial arrogance of the Gilded Age. She placed her hand against the interior wall. It was cool to the touch but dry. On the other side of that 3 feet of straw, the world was dying, but in here life continued, suspended in a bubble of golden light and dead air. When the storm finally broke 48 hours later, the silence that fell over the Montana territory was more deafening than the wind had been. The sun rose on a world that had been erased. The familiar landmarks, fences, gullies, roads were gone, smoothed over by an ocean of blinding white snow that had drifted in places to heights of 15 and 20 feet. Mei Lin and Chan had to dig their way out, tunneling through the snow that had buried the entrance to their tunnel. When they finally broke through the crust and emerged into the dazzling sunlight, the air was still lethally cold, hovering around 20 below zero, but the sky was a piercing, innocent blue. They climbed to the top of a drift to survey the aftermath. The devastation was immediately visible. In the distance, the dark shapes of cattle dotted the white expanse, frozen where they stood, some upright, trapped in drifts, others fallen in huddled groups. This was the beginning of what history would call the Great Die-Up, an event where nearly 90% of the cattle in the northern plains would perish. But Mei Lin's eyes were drawn to the Miller estate. The house was still standing, its white paint stark against the snow, but there was no smoke rising from the chimney. The windows were dark, and the property had a stillness that suggested a tomb. Chun looked at his aunt, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Do we go?" he asked, his voice hushed. Mei Lin nodded once. "Boil water," she commanded. "Fill the jugs." "We go." They strapped on makeshift snowshoes fashioned from willow branches and rawhide, carrying heavy clay jugs of hot water wrapped in wool, and began the slow, exhausting trek across the frozen drifts toward the neighbor who had laughed at them. The scene inside the Miller house was one of grim desperation. When Chun kicked open the front door, the air inside felt little different from the air outside, save for the lack of wind. Josiah Miller and his foreman were found in the kitchen, huddled together under a pile of rugs and tapestries torn from the walls, their bodies convulsing with the advanced stages of hypothermia. They were barely conscious, their skin waxy and pale, their lips a frightening shade of blue. The grand furnace was cold. The furniture was gone. When Miller opened his eyes and saw the small, stoic figure of Mei Lin standing in his doorway, framed by the blinding snow, he did not speak. He could not. His jaw was locked tight from the cold. Mei Lin did not offer a speech about hubris. She simply gestured to Chan, who began to pour the hot water into tin cups, forcing the men to drink. They wrapped the hot clay jugs in the men's frozen coats and pressed them against their cores. It took an hour before Miller could speak, and when he did, his voice was a broken rasp, stripped of all its former boom and bluster. It never stopped," he whispered, his eyes wide and haunted. "The cold. It just walked through the walls." He looked at Mei Lin, really looked at her for the first time, not as a curiosity or a nuisance, but as a savior. "How?" he asked. "How are you not dead?" Mei Lin looked around the cavernous, freezing kitchen, at the high ceilings designed to trap heat far above human heads, and the thin walls designed for appearances rather than function. "You built a cage for the heat to escape," she said softly. "I built a trap to keep it." They moved the men, stumbling and weak, back to the hay dome, dragging them on a sled. As they crawled through the low tunnel and entered the main chamber of the igloo, the blast of warmth, 60 degrees of humid, living heat, hit Miller like a physical blow. He began to weep, the tears freezing on his cheeks before melting in the warmth of the compost heap. The legacy of Mei Lin's hay igloo extended far beyond that single winter. Josiah Miller survived, but his finances did not. He lost 90% of his herd and was forced to sell his land, ironically, to a cooperative of smaller farmers who adopted many of the immigrant techniques he had once scorned. He moved back east, a quieter, humbler man, leaving the Victorian house to rot until it was eventually pulled down for scrap lumber. Mei Lin, however, remained. She lived on her plot for another 20 years, eventually replacing the hay dome with a sod house, though she always maintained that the straw was warmer. Her method of construction, though born of desperation, prefigured the straw bale building revival that would take hold in the late 20th century among eco-architects and sustainability experts. She proved that the smartest person in the room isn't usually the one with the loudest voice or the biggest bank account, but the one who understands the environment they live in. The neighbors who had laughed at the crazy Chinese widow eventually came to ask her for advice on planting, on weather signs, and on insulation. She shared what she knew, not with arrogance, but with the quiet generosity of someone who knows that winter comes for everyone eventually. Today, if you drive through the high plains of Montana, you will see endless miles of barbed wire and modern ranch houses. But if you look closely at the history, you will find that the true foundation of survival in the West wasn't built on timber and coal, but on the stubborn, quiet wisdom of a woman who knew that sometimes the best way to fight the storm is to build a nest and wait. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical survival, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Would you trust your life to a house made of hay? Stay warm and we'll see you in the next one.